Alrighty, can you everybody hear me here? Perfect. Well, let's get started here with my talk called Ngrx Best Practices for Enterprises. I'm excited for the opportunity to speak to everybody here tonight, and hopefully we can all learn a little bit together here. So first of all, for those who don't know me, my name is Jordan Powell. I'll get a little bit there'll be more details about myself at the end, but just to give a little bit of reference of who the person talking is, my name is Jordan, and if you have any questions at any point, feel free to raise your hand or just speak up, and I'd love to feel free to interject and answer any questions that I can along the way. So first of all, for a lot of people, I've probably heard of Ngrx. I want to go ahead and give a little bit of debrief for people who maybe have never used it, or just a refresher for those who are currently using it. But essentially, a lot of people, when they think of Ngrx, they think of it as, oh, it's a state management library, which it is, but it's really more than that. It's a framework. Ngrx as a framework, it is a framework because you're building reactive applications in Angular, and it provides both state management solutions, and isolation of side effects, entity collection management, router bindings, code generation, and developer tools that will enhance your life as a developer's experience when building the many different tools of types of applications that you're going to be building. So it's more than just state management. It's isolation effects, state management, entity collection, router bindings, code generation, and so forth. Provides a way to manage state, like we mentioned, and this is the thing that most people are familiar with Ngrx. I think we had someone just join. Perfect. So yeah, the store provides reactive state management for Angular apps. It's inspired by Redux, for those who don't know, and it essentially unifies the events in your application and derives state using RxJS. It also provides an isolation of side effects. So it sort of encapsulates and removes the side effects of your application from the UI of your application. It gives a whole framework really for isolating those side effects from your components, and it does it through connecting observables of actions to your store. And finally here, it helps really unlock productivity because it provides, when I say it, I'm referring to Ngrx. They provide schematics which help you really avoid writing common boilerplate, over and over again in your app. And yes, it wouldn't be an Ngrx talk if I didn't use the word boilerplate. So let's really get to the why you should use Ngrx for state management. I will say, for me, there are several reasons why you should use state management. For me, the rule of thumb, and the talk is for enterprise applications. And so really, if you're using Angular already, I really feel like Ngrx is pretty much a must-have from my experience, for many reasons. And we'll kind of get to some of those here, but I really feel like for multiple reasons, it really just provides you an opportunity by just doing a little bit more, maybe work up front to implement a feature, but really can save you from, technical debt and bigger issues that will follow down the road. Because really, Ngrx provides state management for, creating maintainable applications, but it allows you to create explicit applications because you're storing single state and the use of, actions and messages in an order to express those state changes. So these are some of the, I guess, highlighted points of why you'd want to use it. So see if I can never pronounce this word, but serializability. I think that's how you say it. Serializability. It normalizes your state changes and passes them through observables. And because Ngrx provides serializability, ensures state is predictably stored. It enables you to save your state to external, storages like databases, local storage, something like that. Allows you to inspect, download, upload, and dispatch actions from all the store dev tools as well. So you can have comfort knowing that if you're calling an external service that that has a database or something like that, if those services are they're going to have to serialize your data, you can know that that your data is serializable because Ngrx enforces that pattern. You're provided with type safety, which is really is promoted throughout the whole architecture in Ngrx. And what it does is it relies on the TypeScript compiler for correctness in that area. One of probably my favorite reasons or benefits of Ngrx is the encapsulation that it provides, because when you're if you use Ngrx, the effects in the store, any interaction with any external sources that would have a side effect, like HTTP, if you're making an HTTP request to a service or a WebSocket or something like that, those side effects are completely encapsulated from the UI, and ultimately then it really provides a lot of value to you in the long run as a developer with those being encapsulated. And then finally, testability. Because excuse me, sorry, I was trying to get this adjusted here. Testability, Ngrx, because it basically utilizes pure functions, so everything going in and coming out is tested just using pure functions. So your reducers, which essentially are pure functions, are very easy to test, that knowing that you can know with certainty the effects of your state going into your store, that they're going to be affected the way you expect, and then coming out as well using selectors. So that's also another great, incredible benefit, knowing that you can encapsulate all the side effects and test the repetitive behaviors of your applications. And obviously performance, a super important part, because Ngrx, like I said, uses those pure functions and memoized selectors. It really allows you to create very performant applications. So when should I use Ngrx for state management? Well, I mentioned it earlier. I really feel like any application that that you build that has any level of sustainability, or beyond just a few basic beyond a few just basic things, I think that ultimately the more pain points that your app has, the more benefits you're going to have with Ngrx. And so the Ngrx website has they reference what they refer to as the Sherry principle. So these are sort of like, the way I would put it, like pain points and requirements of your application. And essentially Ngrx really is a great solution for solving these complex problems in your applications. And so the more that you have to do any one of these things, And more importantly, the more you anticipate your app will have to do in the future of these things, the more using Ngrx is going to provide value for you in the long run. I also think that for those of you who are working on teams of people, a lot of people maybe dislike Ngrx because they think that is very opinionated, and essentially a lot of people, they don't like that, but because of its opinionated nature, it really, in my opinion, helps your teams work efficiently because you're all working in the same sort of consistent pattern. So back to the Sherry principle that was mentioned, the first instance is shared. So if you're building an application that where the state is shared and accessed by different components and services throughout your app, this Ngrx does an excellent job of doing this. So if you're having components or state that is shared between one component to another component, it's very easy to do that with Ngrx. Obviously, I've built applications where you have your parent component that then passes like a prop or an input into a child component, that property. Well, that's really easy to do with Angular, but if you have dozens and hundreds of components in your application and data is shared throughout all of that, sometimes I've found where you ultimately end up designing the structure of the way the UI components are laid out based upon some of those restrictions. And so you're thinking, well, I need to create a component here because I need to pass this value into here, or you end up creating shared services that are then shared throughout your whole application. But if those services break, there's side effects that affect, throughout. The implications really affect your entirety of your app. But with Ngrx, because you have shared state, you can select any particular piece of that state throughout any part of your application in an extremely efficient manner. So it's very easy to share state anywhere in your app, no matter where it's located in sort of the DOM. If you need hydrated state, so essentially if you have state that is persisted from an external source like a database or something like that, if you need your local state on your client to be hydrated and in sync with that external database or something like that, instead of constantly having to call it or having to manage to make sure they're in sync, Ngrx provides, through its indirection, it really provides a very simple way to keep your state hydrated. If you need state that is easily available, so it needs to be available when you re-enter route. So I've worked on applications before where basically there's a certain, it was like a form. So you fill out the certain section of the form, and then you fill it out, and then you press continue or save or something like that. And then essentially it saves to the database, but then it reroutes, and on the change of the route, it then has to then go and call the external data source, to make that call to get the data, because it doesn't have an active, because it's not managing the state locally, it has to go to the database to get that. So really, and we've all done that, but having state that is available when you re-enter routes is really beneficial, because what would happen is, depending upon the size of the scale of your app, you would reroute into a certain part of your application, and we'd have like a loading indicator, and depending upon your connection, it may be hanging there for a little bit, and ultimately, any level of any type of weight that you're asking your users to do is really going to hurt you from the front end standpoint. So just having state that is always available, so that way, as soon as if you reroute, that state is already stored in your client, and so it can just access it immediately, is super valuable. If you need to retrieve state, so anytime that if you have an application that is going to, like we mentioned, is going to be calling an external data source, like a API or database or something like that, you're retrieving data from some source. Anytime you do that, there are side effects that are associated with that, network latencies, retrying, handling of errors, all those things that Ngrx effects module provides a really easy solution and way to handle retrieving state that ultimately has side effects. And then finally, state that is impacted. So essentially, if you have state that is impacted by different actions or events from other sources in your app, state that is ultimately is going to be changed or impacted from various parts in your application, again, is another pain point. So these are, in my opinion, are 5 pretty common, I guess, complex things that in and of themselves are not hard to solve, but as applications begin to grow, and when we're talking in context of enterprise applications, these problems can become more and more challenging as the project grows, and ultimately, Ngrx really limits, technical debt and just the ability to, maintain an application that's not going to, cost you immensely as you go. So finally, last slide here before we get to some of the best practices is this is a diagram that actually built and it's actually on the Ngrx docs, and it basically shows from a high level what Ngrx does. You'll see some of the key concepts here are, we have actions, which are basically consider it like a message. They essentially describe unique events that are dispatched. So a component says, hey, the user clicked on this button, or this effect said, hey, I got this data from this service, or if you're connected to the router store, that basically effect that listens for, those route changes is, hey, I know now that you've entered this route, go do this thing. So basically actions are essentially like different events that happen throughout your application, or messages in a lot of ways. And those actions are then passed into reducers, which are essentially just pure functions that basically they take the current state passed into them, and the current state of the store plus the action that's passed into it, and it will compose a new state from that. So if you had a list of a list of animals in here, and there was a cat and a dog, and you passed an action that says, hey, add an animal, it would then take the current list of 2 animals, and then it would add the additional animal that you added into it, a copy of it, and put it in here. The other thing to keep in mind, we'll get into a little bit more, is Ngrx uses immutability, so that state is never mutated. You just create copies with the changes of state that you expect, and then it replaces the old state with the new copied state. And then we have selectors, which are pure functions as well, that are used to select, drive, and compose pieces of the state. So essentially, selectors are awesome because you have this huge, you can have a store full of lots of state, but every component or route or part of your application only is going to care about a few pieces of state at a time in particular. So your selectors can compose the different parts of state that it cares about in particular, and then make that available throughout any parts of the application that needs that exact, I guess, combination of state. And then we have the store, which is essentially state that is all the state, I should say, is stored in the store, and it's basically an observable of state and an observable of actions. So it's kind of like just a store that basically has all the state of your application, and you can update it and select from it throughout your application as needed. So let's get into some of the actual best practices. So first thing first is, let's talk about runtime checks. So runtime checks are optional in version 8 and below. They will be defaulted. They'll be turned on by default in version 9, supposed to. But for those of you, obviously 9 is not currently out yet. So anyone who's using Ngrx currently, I highly recommend adding the runtime checks. And because they're basically, it's a developer's guide to help you follow the Ngrx and Redux core principles and best practices. They're really here to shorten the feedback loop that you get, and sort of the ease of use of, making mistakes when, it's really good for when you're first starting to use Ngrx, or even if you're, a seasoned Ngrx user. It really helps. So you can see in your app module, when you actually add your import your RootStore module, there is a runtime check basically object here that you pass in, and then there are 4 different checks that you can optionally set to Boolean flags, or true or false. We'll go into those here. So there you can see in a little bit clearer, focused in those 4 checks. First one is strict state immutability. The number 1 rule of Ngrx is immutability, and so the strict state immutability check verifies if you as a developer tried to modify the state object itself. And this check is important because it helps you to work with the state in a very predictable way, and it's always possible to make sure you can always recreate the state. You never want your state to be mutated, and so this essentially just verifies that your app is following those rules. So here's an example, a violation of the rule, where you'll see here, you'll see state.todo input is basically, it's assigning a new value, so it's mutating this property. And then you'll see in the second violation here, you have a list of to-dos that you're trying to push onto that array, which pushing to the array actually modifies the array. So that's a violation of the rule. So the fix is here. Whoops, let me go back. Is to spread the state and then basically set the new instance of that to do input to an empty string like you wanted, and then spread the to-dos array, and then add this to the end of that array. So that's sort of the pattern. Instead of pushing, we basically spread the state and add a to-do. So this check basically will throw the flag that makes sure you don't do that. Strict action immutability. So you can see the violated rule here, where where you're not allowed to modify an action. So you passed an action in, and then you're then in the reducer, you're changing the value of that the action that you passed in. So you see, oops, sorry. The fix here is to basically, when you actually dispatch the action or create the action, it generates a unique ID instead of doing it when it actually gets to the reducer. You're actually doing it when you create the action itself. Okay, strict state serializability. There's that word again. So this check verifies if your state is serializable. A serializable state is important if you're trying to persist the current state and if you're trying to rehydrate your state in the future. I mentioned previously, if you have an API or some external data store or something, that it's going to expect that the data you send it is serializable. So this strict check is there to help you. Easy solution. You could see here, dates are not serialized. Dates aren't serializable. So this is going to throw that for loop. When I first turned this on, I was like, oh no, I had all my app, it was blowing up, and I was like, oh no, what's going on? And then I realized it was, these dates I had dates that I weren't serializing. I missed it. Some of them I were, but some of them I wasn't. And it was causing this problem. And it really kind of saved me from further damage down the road, which was nice. And then the fix you can see is convert that to JSON. And then finally, the fourth one is strict action serializability. The check, it resembles the state serializability check, but as the name says, it verifies that the action is serializable. An action must be serializable to be replayed. Excuse me. This can be helpful during development when you're using the Redux dev tools, which we'll talk about here soon. But here you'll see a violation of the rule where we're passing in a function into the action as a prop, and functions aren't serializable, so that will throw an error. So instead, you just pass the object in as a prop, and then you can handle the logging of that in a different manner somewhere else in your application through a factor component or something like that. All right, so now we'll get into some of my favorite features. I guess this isn't so new. It's about a year old, but I highly recommend using these if you're in version 8. I'll show you some examples of creator functions. Basically, we're gonna, for this next portion, we're going to, I was trying to think, I'm a musician, so I was just trying to think of like a kind of an example that wasn't super cheesy. So essentially, we're gonna call a fake instrument database API. And so what we're going to need to basically implement this feature is we're gonna need an action that basically says, hey, I want to load, I want to request that data, and then I'll need a failure action that says, hey, there was a problem getting that data, and then a success that basically says, hey, your instrument came back from the service successfully as a response. In version 7, this will look super familiar because you had to do, for those 3 things, you had about 24 lines of code. You had to, in order to create an action, you had to create a class that implements the action interface, and then you would then do that for each instance, each action that you created, and then you would need to create enums for each of those actions, and then you had to create type unions down here that would combine those things. those enums and those actions. So you see about 24 lines of code to basically just say, hey, I want 3 different actions. With using, you can see here, you can see the instance of that's how you created those classes and the type unions. With you can now use in version 8 action creators. Basically, they are, it's a method or not a method. It's a function. This method is it creates it's a factory function, or essentially it's a function that returns a function. So now we cut down this line of code pretty significantly by just using creator functions, using the create action method, which you can just import from Ngrx store. You basically you export these as const and you name them, which is the name that you'll then use later to dispatch or listen to in your effects. But essentially, you just use create action. You then pass in the name that you want. So you can see that's an example there. You pass in the, you name your action, and good action hygiene is to use brackets that describe that little, the feature that you're on, and then outside of the brackets describe something that describes the actual action within inside of that feature. And then you can add in an optional prop, props, which are basically if you want to have any sort of, used to be payload, and so you'll see your pass instruments here, an error message. It basically you're saying, hey, I'm going to expect a string, and instruments, I'm going to expect an array of a list of instruments. Dispatching actions. Let's see, in version 7, it's very, very similar. The only difference being in version 7, because actions were classes that implemented the action interface, we had to actually create a new, essentially, class to create those actions. With version 8, we basically, they're functions, so we just call the function directly. So we just import the action and then call the function directly. So subtle differences, but just a note if you're new to them. Creating reducers. So in this example, we're going to pass those 3 actions into our reducer and manipulate the state as expected. Recalling back to the Redux pattern, we can't directly update the state. We must, through pure functions, take in the current state, an action, return a new updated state with the action applied. You'll see here the old way in version 7. In previous, you created a function that passed in the initial state and the actions union, and then it returns the state of that feature. And then it has a switch statement that basically each case is on the action type, and then it returned the state with the immutable version of that state for each action. So you can see it's 31 lines of code here to do this. You can see those are the actions. That's the state being returned. In version 8, create reducer is significantly less. We see it's pretty easy. We by using the create reducer function, you then pass in the initial state as the first property in that function. It uses, instead of a switch statement, it uses something called ons, which are basically like, it's kind of like reading like, on this instance of this action, I want to handle the state X, Y, Z. So for each is almost essentially the same as it was, but it's just a different syntax. So use on, then you describe the action, and then the different state. that is affected. And then ultimately down here, you then export the function reducer, and then you just return that create reducer method that you did above. So significantly less code. Creating effects, very similar. We would listen for the load request action, then call the instrument service.get instruments fake endpoint that would return a list of instruments, and then on success it would dispatch a load success action passed in the instrument's response. And then in the event of catching, if there was an error from the service 404, 500, something along those lines, it would catch the error and dispatch a load failure action with the error that returned from the service. So you see 23 lines of code with the create effects. It's turns of 14. So in each of these instances, it's not quite half, but it's pretty significant difference in the amount of code. So it's pretty simple. We use of type to call the instrument actions.load requests constant. We then call the instrument service.get instruments, map those results to a load success action, and an instance of an error, we're going to dispatch the load failure action. Next, important thing, I'm sure most of you are using this if you're using Ngrx, but the Redux dev tools is extremely amazing tool. It's great for debugging your application state changes. It's an extension provided. It's in the Chrome, I guess what you call extension library, and it can be used with any application that uses Redux. See a closer example of it. On the left here, you'll see a history of all the actions that are dispatched in your application, and then on the right you can see the exact action that was dispatched, like the props that were passed into it, the state of your store at that given moment, and differences from what was currently in the store versus what you passed into it. It's pretty amazing to be able to, without setting breakpoints or logging, doing a bunch of logging, to be able to literally, and you can time travel, so go back in different points of your application, click on it, see what was the state here, click on the next action, what was the state here, and keep clicking until you find the issue that you're trying to debug. So pretty awesome tool for those who haven't used the Redux dev tools. To do so, it's pretty simple to install. You just install for Ngrx. There's a module for it at Ngrx/store DevTools. And then all you have to do is in your app module is just do .instruments, and then there are some different configs that you can pass into it. The max age is essentially it's like a history of the last 25 actions or states that were, I guess, dispatched in your store. You can, by default is 25. You can change that to lower or higher depending upon, I guess, your use case. Ultimately, the higher you go, the less performant it's going to be. And so depending upon if you have a lot of actions that mutate, state, it may not be something you really want to have a high number on, but again, it's something you can easily change. There's a name property, which is also would basically essentially be the name that shows up in the dev tools extension, and then there's a log only, which restricts your extension basically to logging and being available for certain things. So if you don't want it on production, you only want it in dev and test or whatever, you can easily set those flags. So now to one of my probably the meat of this talk is the way you want to structure your application. So this is a method that I learned from my great friend Wes Grimes. He has an amazing article on this. I'm actually going to just kind of highlight the parts that kind of walk you through it and talk about the benefits that I've noticed in my applications by doing this. I realized that really by taking this approach, you really help, you really give yourself the leeway to grow your application throughout or through time. So you see that we're going to have a RootStore module. So in a high level, you're going to have an app module that then imports what we're going to create a RootStore module that contains basically a root state of your application, and then some root selectors that will basically select parts of your application that are available that come from all the different features of your app. So then the RootStore module imports various features. So 1 feature, 2 feature, 3 features, so forth. Those you import those into the RootStore module, and then each one of those feature store modules have their own state, actions, reducers, effects, and selectors. So by doing this, you are really decoupling the state and the side effects of your application in a very maintainable way as your applications grow. So in order to install it, again, you just want to install store, DevTools, and effects. We're just going to use the Angular CLI to create a module called RootStore. We're going to create an interface called RootState. And then we're going to import RootStore module into the app module, and then we're going to add the store dev tools as well, so that way you can have the time traveling logging debugging tool that we were just talking about. So now we're going to go to talk about the different feature modules we'll create. So going back to our other example of using instruments, we're going to create an instruments feature. So in order to do this, we need to use the Angular CLI, do ng generate a module inside RootStore, and we're going to call it the instrument store. Or in Wes's example, he uses FruitStore, or whatever your feature is, basically the feature name dash store. Then we're going to need to create actions. We're going to have the same actions. We're going to load requests action, load failure action that has a prop of error message of string, and a load success action that has properties of instruments, which are a list of instruments. And then we're going to create an instruments.state.ts file in that instrument store directory. Here, we're going to create an interface that contains the state for just that feature. So just for the instruments state feature part of the application. So for this, we're going to need an isLoading flag we're basically triggering if we wanted to alert the user like, hey, hang on a second, we're loading this from an external data source. It's a flag, the error, and a list of instruments. And then we're going to export initial state const that of the type interface we just created. And those are the properties there are just the initial state that we are going to use later. You'll see in the app. So then we're going to create an instruments reducer in the instruments store directory. We're going to, important thing to note here is one of the things that I didn't like is basically the Angular or the Ngrx, the way it handles 4 features is it uses a magic string. But I noticed that Wes had taught me that you can create a feature key, and it's basically you can then use this through the different places in your feature that reference this. So recommend doing that. You can use a create reducer, or use the create reducer function we talked about. Pass in the initial state that we set on the previous slide. Then we're going to reduce each one of those actions like we already did previously, and we're going to return those and export the reducer. Now we're going to create an instruments .selectors file in the instrument store directory. Here we're going to reference, we're going to use the create feature selector creator function, which takes in a generic T, and in this case we're going to use the instrument state interface we created, and then we're passing in the feature key that we created in the previous slide, and then we're selecting the errors, the is loading flag, and the list of instruments using the create selector function. We're then going to create an instruments.effects file in the instrument store directory with the following as well. So we're gonna call this effect a load request, you basically pipe into the actions that are dispatched throughout all your application. You're going to listen for actions that are of type load request. So anytime this action is dispatched, this effect will catch that, is going to then call the get instrument service, pipe into that. It's going to then take the instruments response from the get instruments API and dispatch the instruments load success with the response that we talked about, and catch any errors, dispatch the load fails action. So now we get to go into barrel rolls, which I know are somewhat controversial for whatever reason, but ultimately this is something I highly recommend doing as well. So basically, for the things that like actions and selectors, I recommend just import star as instrument actions or instrument selectors from those files, and then export those. And then later in your app, you'll see the benefits of why doing this, and then export your instrument state, your initial state, and your state module as well. Now back to the root state module. So like the feature state module, we are going to create a root-state.ts file. We're going to create an interface inside this file that has a property for all the features of our application. So we know we have an instruments feature, so we're going to create an instruments property that is of type the instrument state that we created, and we're going to, for sake of brevity, we're just going to call it an other feature and other feature state property. And then same thing, initial state, where we set the initial state for the root state of the application. Now we're going to update. This is kind of one of the really cool things, update our RootStore module. So what we do is we import all those feature state modules into the RootStore module. So the instrument store module, other feature store module, and all the features of your Ngrx store that you created, you import them here. And then all you have to do is do store module for root and effects module dot for root. And then you can very easily create decoupled features of your application without really affecting the other parts of your application. And then what we can do, we mentioned in that you can create state or select state from the root of your application. And in this example, we want to, as we implement more and more features, we're going to most likely call make more API requests. And so on every API request, we want to listen for errors, and we want to know if the app is loading, not loading. So in the root state of our application, we can then create memorize selectors that listen for those errors, is loading, and other shared state across your features. So here you can see in this example, we're selecting the instruments store selectors errors, and the other feature store selectors errors, as well as the loading as well. Then you just pass those in like this, and then you return these and use OR statements. So it's really awesome that as you can have very decoupled features of your application, but also still get for the instances that where you need to catch errors or display loaders or things like that, you can very easily just chain these in to these RootStore selectors. And of course, again, another barrel roll. And so here you'll see we're going to import the RootStore selectors, all these things, and then you're going to import the instrument store, the other feature store, and export those. So all the things are sort of barrel rolled in, and it makes it really easy to reference all the different actions and selectors and parts of your application in your components and so forth. So then here, the main benefit of Ngrx is that essentially most of your components throughout your app become dumb components. And essentially you'll see in like this example, we're going to have an instruments component. You pass to basically for your component to access the store, you just have to import or inject the store into the component here, and then you pass in the state that you want, whether it be the root state or the feature state. In this instance, we could have done you could do root state or you could do feature state. Either one could work. We're going to implement the on it from Angular. You can see the ng on init method here, and then we're going to say, hey, when this component initializes, we want to dispatch a load request action. This could if we were to use the Angular or the Ngrx router store, we could easily have triggered this, caught this in effect using listening for router changes or something like that. So this could be handled through other ways, but as you can see, a pretty simple instance of this or an implementation is just on the initialization of this app. I want to dispatch the load request action. It's like, hey, I need this. I need the instruments. And then all we have to do is, there's a lot of examples I've seen where inside the ng on init, you would subscribe to the values of those instruments and then take until the component destroys or something like that. But really, with Angular's async pipe, you don't need to do that. The beauty is you can just select your observable properties like this. So you have an instruments dollar that equals this.store.select, and then the select instrument selector, and it will then you can then access it like this inside the store. So here we're just have a instrument component that will list out all the instruments, in a pretty cool way, I'm sure. And so we're using ng4. It's going to loop through each and every one of them. We then, to access those observables inside our templates, all we have to do is use the pipe operator with async, and Angular will automatically handle the subscribing and unsubscribing for those, which I highly recommend. That way you don't get memory leaks throughout your application. And then you just, so you can, do let instrument of instruments dollar async, or pipe async, and then you pass in that instrument into the instrument component, and it will list all the instruments for you. So what are some takeaways here? This is just high level things we talked about. Make sure to use strict runtime checks. Again, those are really there to help you as a developer, so that way you're following the rules of Ngrx as you go, so you avoid sort of catching, running into mistakes down the line that you could have easily caught when you were creating that feature. Recommend using the RootStore Module structure. Again, it provides a very, very portable a way of structuring your store that allows you to continue to add and remove features without it sort of breaking all the other parts of your application. So it really decouples a lot of that. Use the Redux Dev tools if you're not already doing it. It's just such a great time traveling debugger for you as you're building your applications. And then I also recommend using, we haven't gone over it, but there is another module in Ngrx called the router store, which basically you import it into your store, and then basically you have access to all the router information from Angular. So I'm building an app right now that's basically like based upon, if you it takes the query parameters or the properties, certain parts of the route of your app. So when your app changes and hits a certain route, then your effect can listen for those properties and call the service that does the thing. So if we use like an e-commerce example, you could have your route changing to a store with a product and a product ID or something like that. Well, you could easily, without actually telling declaratively to, hey, I want to go get this data from the service, you just listen in an effect for route changes and then pass the product ID list from the router store or from the router and pass that on to the service. And then basically then your component that lists the product details essentially just select it, listening for selected product details, and it just displays it. So it's really, really clean way of being truly reactive in your applications. And then these are just some always remembers. Think of actions as events, not commands. So remember that actions are events. So really take a step back and don't think of like necessarily what your app needs to do. It's just like, think of what are all the events that are going to happen throughout the life cycle of your app. Was it going to be, whether it be user events, whether it be side effects from a service or what have you. Essentially think about your actions as events and not commands. Avoid using anti-patterns. Basically, a lot of people have a hard time grasping Ngrx, and so what they may try to take in the old paradigm of programming of an application, and then they try to hook in NGRX to it, but really you begin to not leverage NGRX for what it's really beneficial for, and so you sort of lose the benefits. And one of those benefits is NGRX indirection. So just knowing that with NGRX, really everything is decoupled from itself, and so you have one indirection. So basically, data is always flowing one way. Actions are dispatched, passed into reducers, then their copies are made, then passed into the store, then the selectors are subscribing to those things, and then select and compose that state, and then pass it down to the components that are subscribing to them. So it just becomes a one direction flow of data throughout your application. And those are the things that really you want to leverage in with NGRX and not fight. Really the final thing to remember is that selectors, reducers, all these things are pure functions, and so you should always test all of those things by testing all your selectors, all your reducers, and your effects. Down the road, as you refactor, as you add features, change parts of your application, you're going to get immediate feedback of state changes, or anything that you've broken along the way. So having great test coverage as you build your application in NGRX, you're really going to have good assurance that your app is working as expected. So you're making essentially your components very pure, very dumb. So there's not logic that really needs to be tested in the majority of your components. And then ultimately the things that are happening in your app are easily tested, from selecting parts out of the store and pushing new state into the store, and then in separate the side effects that happen as a result of it. So this is a little bit about me. You can follow me on Twitter at JordanPowell88. That's also my GitHub repo. I love to, if you enjoyed the talk today, I'd love to DM me, reach out to me. I'd love to grab coffee. I'm located here in Ohio. My blog is jordanpowell.online. And that's it. Anyone have any questions for me? Any questions? Perfect. I don't think so. Maybe.
Hey, Jordan.
Hey.
Yeah, Bhaskar here. Thank you for giving an overview on NGRX best practices.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I was not able to join earlier.
No problem.
But thanks for going over this. So I had a question, like if someone wants to monitor performance in their applications using NGRX, so what are the best tools that you would suggest for anyone to use?
Tools for monitoring performance?
Yeah.
It's a good question for actual tools themselves. I mean, obviously, your Chrome dev tools are going to be helpful to be able to, see network, how long, your network requests take. Really, I think I would just recommend like taking a step back and seeing if you're experiencing performance issues in your application, why do you suspect that is? Is it because you're making too many requests to a database to hydrate, your state? Or is it, another issue where you have memory leaks, something like that? So I guess outside of the dev tools themselves, I'd have to, get back with you. But I think that I would really just question or propose the question, just step back and really the performance issues are probably more it's really like a code smell in a lot of ways, where NGRX is extremely performant. So is it sort of a generic question, or are you speaking on behalf of like an app that's already using NGRX?
No, generally, like if someone, let's say, after using NGRX, let's say they were using Redux before and now they shifted to NGRX. So after that, let's say if they find their application is slow. So based on your experience, what you would suggest them as a first point to go and look after switching over to NGRX?
Okay. Sure. So I would say the first thing to look at is there's probably memory leaks somewhere, or probably lots of places in your application. So a few slides back, I referred to using the async pipe in your templates. I highly recommend that. So many examples. I mean, I've been on Pluralsight, and so many blogs and articles I've read, have people that are subscribing to the your observables in your components, and then just referencing a private property inside that component, where really anytime that you subscribe to that data, you essentially break the reactivity of your application, because the data essentially stops at that point. So that's where, if you're able to use the async pipe in your templates, I would really look throughout your application, refactor any possible place that you're subscribing to your state in your component. I would refactor and think, can this be done? Can I a lot of times what you can use NGRX selectors for is to select like a view model. So you can select an object that has all the different pieces of state that you need for that view. Well, a lot of times I've seen people where they'll have a selector that pulls those 5 things separately, and then subscribe to them, and then create like an object inside the component that has those things, where really you could refactor the code and use a selector to build those, compose that state specifically for that component. So really the things I've noticed is that, to kind of hammer away at your question, is look for any parts of your application where you're subscribing to those observables coming from the store, and ask yourself, like, why is there can it be done a different way? Because in an ideal way, all your components, any place that's actually like consuming the data from the NGRX store, is using the Angular async pipe in its templates. And with that, that you're going to Angular is going to garbage collect and unsubscribe automatically for you, so you're going to get the best performance by doing it that way.
Sure.
Perfect. Anybody else?
So
awesome.
Yep, I don't think we have any other question. I think there is a question. Yeah. Good.
No, thanks, Jordan. I just want to say great job.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Thanks for jumping on.
Great. Good to learn.
Thank you.
All this stuff's great. Great to learn.
Perfect. Thanks. It was fun.
Yeah. Thank you for joining. Yeah. Thanks, Jordan, and thanks for going over all the best practices and answering my questions. So thank you for doing this.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yep. See ya.
Yeah.
Bye.